This is so heavy. You know, justice is heavy.
Heavy lift, guys.
Okay, I'll get us started. Good morning, my name is Nicole McAfee, and I'm the Smart Justice Campaign Manager with the ACLU of Oklahoma. Thank you all so much for your time today, especially after so many of you were here late last night as the votes came in. I'm glad that legislators seem to be feeling the urgency to fix our system. I'm here today because those most directly impacted by the failures of our criminal justice system can't speak out. They don't have the option of a work stoppage. They can't walk out. They've been locked away, often out of sight and out of mind. Oklahoma has failed them, and as our incarceration rate continues to grow, we continue to fail future generations of Oklahomans. We are here today because after being promised again and again that this would be the session of meaningful criminal justice reform, the best we seem to be able to do is watered down versions of already compromised bills, created by the prosecutors who benefit most from the failed system, and political leaders looking to say they've accomplished change while being unable to tell us what the impact of these bills will be. We hope that the spirit we saw in the House last night, one that embraced the need for bipartisan solutions, is one that will carry over as we address the most urgent problem facing our state, our criminal justice system. Now I'd like to invite a few of my fellow advocates here with the ACLU's Campaign for Smart Justice and Voice to share with you why they're here, starting with Reverend Dr. Stan Basler, a member of Voice.
Thank you. It is my privilege to talk about the criminal justice system and possible reform from a biblical theological perspective. The Bible teaches that all persons are created in the image of God, that we should value all persons, that we should love others, and understand the possibility that people can indeed become new creations. We're encouraged to live our lives in faith, not in fear. And in many ways, the system we have is fear-based. It is good public policy and good theology to develop a system that's reasonably calculated to produce a pro-social end product. And we're also certainly commanded biblically to have care and regard for the poor among us. It seems that the system we have today has punishment as its currency, the willful and deliberate infliction of suffering. And at the same time, the hope of the system is to reform or rehabilitate people. We ask the question, are those incompatible goals? Is it a contradiction to expect meaningful change from the infliction of pain? And the system itself is in many ways dependent on poor people to pay for its operation. Better goals are accountability, restitution, compensation, restoration, and reconciliation. So specifically, what about the reform issues do we think would be compatible with our biblical theological perspectives? Number one, to reduce the reliance on fines and fees for operation of the system. Those kinds of burdens rob people of hope, and hope is very important in bringing about changed lives. Understanding that a pain-based system one that isolates people in prisons, is socially, economically, and relationally disabling, and not to rely on that unless absolutely necessary, which means getting rid of mandatory minimums, reducing sentences for nonviolent offenses, and finally, understanding that addiction is a public health issue instead of a criminal justice issue, and relying more and more on treatment, alternative courts such as drug courts. All of these things, it seems, are much more likely to produce a pro-social end product than what we have today. I remember a lifetime ago being a high school student and somebody asking our civics teacher, Mrs. Smith, how should we treat people when they come out of prison? Her answer, we treat them as people who've paid their debt to society. That also seems an important reform, not only legally, but socially. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stan. Next up, we have Father Tim Lucian, also a member of Voice.
Good morning. We are concerned as members of Voice with the lack of movement in criminal justice reform. As a member of Voice, I'm also a pastor at St. Charles Borromeo Catholic Church, and we listen to our families, and we know that many of our families are affected by this lack of movement in criminal justice reform. We know that our state is in a terrible situation with reduced funds available, and at the same time we're talking about possibly building more prisons and not reducing the cost of our justice system. That means that monies are taken away from other projects that are very much important to our people, the people in my congregation, education, healthcare, different things that affect people. And so as we continue to commit more money to this justice system that is broken, then we're taking monies away from other things that affect many family members. At the same time, we know that this destructive to our families and to individuals. Instead of giving them hope and helping them to see how they might be able to pay their debt to society and at the same time return to society to be productive members of our communities, that we are not committing any sizable funds to helping people with addiction recovery, with helping to educate those who are in our incarceration system so that they will be able to be prepared to take jobs and to support their families. We hear of children in our parishes that are being raised by their grandparents, by their aunts and uncles, and that this puts a financial burden on many families. And when their parents come out of the justice system, then they are not able to meaningfully find employment to support their families. We also know that our justice system is suffering from a tremendous overcrowding, that the system means that we are putting people into inhumane conditions, something that is denying the dignity of all human beings. And so we would want to urge our legislators to do something to make our system more just and meaningful for those people that are in the system, and also to help us to find ways in which we can reduce the number of people who are in our justice system, at the same time finding ways in which people who are convicted of crimes to be able to return to society after paying their debts to be meaningful members of our community.
Thank you, Father. I would now like to invite forward Maury Turner, Regional Field Director with the ACLU of Oklahoma's Campaign for Smart Justice.
Hi. So we've heard a little bit about people that are on the outside looking in, but I guess to share a little bit about my story is that I was brought up in a single-parent household, taught to also be an activist and a survivor from birth. And it's my duty to help others around me in any way, shape, or form that I can. Up until around 7th grade, my father was in and out of prison, and it really tore our household apart, but I didn't realize that probably up until a couple of years ago, because I was raised in a system, in a school system, in a society that told me that we should treat prisoners the same, like they're prisoners long after they leave. And so I didn't realize that the criminal justice system had done a really good job of tearing my family apart long after my father left the prison system. So what I do now and what I've dedicated my life to is criminal justice reform. So in my time with the Smart Justice Campaign, we've been tackling things like prosecutorial reform, sentencing reform, bail reform, reentry programs. And it's key to realize and to add in those voices, right? So many times we talk about people from the outside looking in, but it's so important to get people on the inside of the system to talk about what's best for them and what they need. And that's the work that we're trying to do right now. So this is just a little snippet of my story, but this is the story of thousands of Oklahomans, right? And so a key point in trying to include people in these stories and include people in this work is creating self-sustaining organizing communities. And a way that we're doing that now is conducting community conversations. Our next community conversation is this evening at 7 p.m. at the Church of the Open Arms. And we invite you all to come and join in on this conversation to see what we should be doing better, what Oklahoma should be doing better, and to help us with this cause and this fight. So if that's something that you're impassioned by, that you're moved by, please come join us. 7 p.m. tonight, Church of the Open Arms.
Thank you. We are grateful for everyone who could be here today, for all of those standing with us who are taking time to talk to their legislators about why they fight, about why we can't settle for anything less than meaningful reform. Reform that addresses our rapidly growing incarceration rate. Reform that addresses prisons and jails that are already over capacity. Reform that addresses the fines and fees that make our state a debtor's prison. Reform that seeks to end the racial disparities in our incarcerated population. Reform that addresses the fact that our criminal justice system is anything but just. Real reform now. Criminal justice reform is an issue at the intersection of so many of the problems facing Oklahoma. It provides us potential budget solutions, but it also demands we address the need to provide adequate mental health care and treatment options for folks suffering from addiction. It makes us take a hard look about how we treat other people here in our state. The legislature has the power to change the course of our criminal justice system and of Oklahoma. State Question 780 proved that the will of the voters is there. We want to see real reform now. But that means no more backroom deals with prosecutors. It requires bringing together the bipartisan coalition of advocates and working together to make real change with measurable outcomes a reality now. Waiting, compromising on the backs of the most vulnerable Oklahomans, it sentences us not to just a life with a broken system, but generations of trauma for Oklahoma. Myself, our speakers, representatives from Voice, will now take questions and be available to talk.
You mentioned backroom deals with prosecutors. What specifically are you talking about?
When the governor announced the most recent package of reforms, some of which we're still waiting for finalized language on, that announcement was made with district attorneys. A big complaint from a lot of the public and advocates alike is that they weren't there at the table to talk about what these changes meant, that they were compromising a compromise that was already created by a bipartisan coalition in the Justice Reform Task Force. And we would like to see that process open and transparent so that we can have a discussion about what the real outcomes would be and that we can see meaningful change.
Just to follow up, has there been adequate funding for 780, 781? Are there any bills that support 780, 781 right now?
So we saw a really great bill at the start of the session, Senate Bill 969, from Senator Roger Thompson, that would have taken 780 and allowed folks to apply for retroactive sentence modifications. It could have meant as more than 800 folks currently incarcerated being able to get out of our prisons and jails. It would have meant more than $9 million added back into the budget. It would also have allowed an unmeasurable number of Oklahomans who live with felony records to apply to have those changed so that they can get housing and jobs without that, hanging around their necks. It unfortunately did not make it out of committee, but we're still hopeful as we kind of come up upon these final deadlines that people look at the bills that are still alive and take the opportunity to add in some language that is really going to make reforms meaningful.
In talking to lawmakers
I think I speak for myself, but our biggest problem again and again is kind of working against some misinformation, largely coming out of prosecutors' offices, but also just this need to provide adequate funding. And I think a lot of it's just being put into other places within the criminal justice system right now. And I think that folks on all sides of this issue really could come together and find common ground if we had the opportunity to sit down and work on a meaningful solution.
Does the fact that this is an election year have anything to do with legislators' reluctance to make any real meaningful change or fear of looking soft on that?
It is possible, but I think that we saw with State Question 780 that voters are ready for us not to be tough on crime but smart on crime. And I'd note that it's not just an election year for legislators. Every single district attorney in the state of Oklahoma is up for election this year too. And I hope that they will really talk with their voters about the need for real reform.
The other legislation we've seen movement on is a package endorsed by Fallon and prosecutors. Still, we haven't seen a lot of movement in the last week. What's new? Is there anything sort of new or specifically you guys are hoping happens in the next week or so?
We're hoping that we sit down and talk about the language that exists in those bills, that as we talk about moving it, we don't move it just for the sake of moving it and checking off a box for reform, but that we talk about the way it was originally written and what folks hope to get out of that and how we can look at the meaningful impact that'll have on our current rate of incarceration. Okay. Thank you so much.
Kim, offer's open.